A feminist will more readily accept that they have an obligation to anyone else on the planet. A feminist will feel greater obligation to like a random third world Somali con artist living down the street than they will to their own husband. As a happily married man, I very often come across things that make me think, wow, I'm glad that isn't me. I very often come across that sort of thing where I see what's happening in the personal lives and relationships of other people. And I think, thank God, I'm just glad I'm not that person. And it's not a gloating thing. It's more of a gratitude. It's a sense of gratitude that, wow, okay, glad I'm not in that situation. And I had that experience when reading this op-ed in the Telegraph written by, Celia Warden, who happens to be apparently the wife of Piers Morgan. Piers recently fell and broke his hip, and that was about 2 weeks ago that this happened. But already his wife is fed up with the relatively minor inconvenience that this has caused in her life. And she wrote an entire editorial complaining about this. Here's the headline. Caring for my invalid husband, Piers, is the biggest test of our wedding vows. I signed up to in sickness and health, but it's almost 2 weeks since he broke his hip, and my patience with my patient is wearing thin. Wow. Now, granted, again, 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Now, I think this article, granted, is supposed to be funny to some extent. It's not really funny, but I think that's some of what she's going for. It's always hard to tell when women try to, write something funny. Because it's not going to actually be funny, so you have to think I think that it's a translation thing. It's like listening to someone speak in a different language and they're gesticulating wildly and you're just trying to interpret, I think, what he's trying to say. So when a woman's trying to be funny, you're like, I think what she's attempting here is comedy, I think, but I'm not sure. So I think there's supposed to be some of that, but what it is just one very long, very public complaint that a wife is making about her husband who committed the sin of getting injured. And so here she is describing her thought process when she found out that her husband broke his hip. And that's when the doom montage started up in both our heads. The little horror movie that plays out in an emergency when all the forthcoming miseries and complications are spliced together in a chilling, fast-forwarded sequence. The general anesthetic, the operation itself, the crutches, the rehab, the massive hit to your professional life, the canceled holiday. Very few things live up or down to the doom montage. As challenging as the aftermath of accidents are, they don't tend to be quite as bad as we think they'll be in the moment of diagnosis. This, however, so much worse. Certainly the biggest test of the vows we've had to endure so far. I signed up to in sickness and health, but there was nothing in the small print about shower stools. And once I'd assembled the most hideous piece of furniture in existence, I sent Piers a picture of it captioned, "This is what the end of a marriage looks like," followed by a laughing emoji. His reply came seconds later, "Way too soon." I had wanted to be a selfless wife, Jennifer Connelly in A Beautiful Mind, and an endlessly tolerant nurse. But as the days have worn on and Piers's snappiness has increased, my patience has worn thin. It's possible that I have on occasion left the remote control just a centimeter out of reach with Love Island on telly. The portion sizes may have been reduced a little, the carbs eliminated and the treats withheld as I have morphed from Florence Nightingale into Nurse Ratched. And we'll get through this, of course we will, but I'll be honest with you, right now I'm one 4 a.m. fallen crutch away from Kathy Bates in Misery. I just want to remind you that she wrote this after 2 weeks of helping her husband. 2 weeks and she's completely fed up. And on top of writing this article, she also appeared on some British morning TV show or a daytime show, I don't know, where she did a whole interview about the injury and how it's affected her and complained that Piers is snappy and impatient and said that she's just looking for an excuse to get out of the house because he's so miserable to be around. So 2 weeks in, and this woman's doing a media tour about why the real victim of her husband's injury is her. This is what you get for marrying a feminist. I mean, this is where it leads. This is why it cannot work. This is why it never works. Marriage requires a level of self-sacrifice that feminists are constitutionally incapable of and fundamentally opposed to. Like, they're not only selfish people, but they're actually opposed in principle to the idea of selfishness, or of selflessness, rather. They're opposed to selflessness, and they have made a virtue of selfishness, especially in the context of a relationship with a man. So this is what you get. And I'll also say, even aside from feminists, and we know that feminists are awful, and if you married one, then it was the worst mistake you've ever made in your life, and it's probably going to destroy your life. I mean, I don't know how else to play. I don't want to be I hate to be Debbie Downer, but if you married a feminist, then you've basically ruined your life. But even non-feminist women still, I think, have a kind of, and that's some of what's coming through in this, still have kind of an innate propensity to get a little bit annoyed at their husbands for being sick or injured. And, that is kind of a thing, if we're being honest. But when you take it out of the feminist context, it comes from a natural place. It comes even from a good place, which is that, first of all, the husband is supposed to be a protector and provider. And obviously if they get injured or they're sick, it's not their fault. And so that's the way it is. But it's unsettling and difficult to see the protector and provider incapacitated, because men are the captains, men are the pilots. And it's like if your pilot on the plane is sick or incapacitated, that's going to make you kind of upset. And I remember once I saw a pilot, it's before we took off, and I could see into the cockpit, and I saw the pilot. This is all I saw. Okay, I saw him do this, rubbing the temple briefly, the universal sign of a headache. I just saw him do that, and he might not have even been doing that. He might have just scratched, but it looked like that. It was enough that I caught my eye. I'm like, what? What are you doing? You have a headache? You're not allowed. You can't have a headache. You have to fly this plane. You cannot have a headache. That's not okay. Like, I'm not at all concerned about your health right now. You got to fly this plane, and you're not allowed to have a headache. You cannot have a headache. Have a headache when you get home, not right now. And so I think there's some of that with women when their husbands are kind of out of commission. And the other thing is that women are naturally empathetic, so they will feel whatever you are feeling. And if you're really stressed out, then they get stressed out. This is one of the reasons why people get annoyed at me when I talk about it, but this is why I say with men that men should not complain very much. They shouldn't unload their emotions. They shouldn't cry in front of their wives. Now, again, if you're sick or injured, then you can't help that. That's just the way it is. But to the extent that you can keep this stuff internalized, to any reasonable extent that you can, you should, because whatever you're feeling, your wife will start to feel that also. In a way that, as a man, it doesn't really work as much the other way. So if you're stressed out, then your wife feels stressed out. If you're in pain as a man, they feel that too. And that's not a bad thing in and of itself. Like, it's good. Men and women are different. And my wife is extremely empathetic, like extremely. And that's great, because that's not exactly my strong suit. It may shock you to learn. Empathy is not exactly my strongest trait. But she's gotten more than enough for both of us, and that's fantastic. But, these two things together can sort of create tension when a man is sick or injured in some way. But this is where it goes back to, you need your wife to not be a feminist. Because no matter what frustration you might feel as a wife, you have to recognize your obligation, your duty to your husband, as husbands must recognize their obligations to their wives. But a feminist rejects the idea that women have any obligation to anyone at all, least of all their husbands. A feminist will more readily accept that they have an obligation to anyone else on the planet. I mean, a feminist will certainly will accept obligations from their boss at work. A feminist will feel greater obligation to, like, a random third world Somali con artist living down the street than they will to their own husband. And, they're fundamentally opposed to the idea of wifely and motherly obligation. So opposed to it that feminism encourages women to kill their children to escape the obligation. That is how opposed to this obligation they are. And so if you marry someone like that, then this is what you get. You marry someone like that, not a good idea, but if that's already happened, then I don't know. never get sick or never need anything because your wife, who is a feminist, will resent and hate you for it. Which in fairness, your wife, the feminist, if she's a feminist, she's going to resent and hate you all the time anyway. So I guess it's really not going to be much different.